Welcome to the Peggy Guggenheim collection. We're here in Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, which was Peggy Guggenheim's house from 1949 till 1979. Peggy Guggenheim, the famous collector and patron of the arts. Please follow me inside. Here we are in the sculpture garden of Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, which includes works by Giacometti, by Hans Arp, by Max Ernst, by Arnaldo Pomodoro, Germaine Richier, and many more. Sculpture was always very important for Peggy Guggenheim, and she continued to collect sculpture throughout her life. But first of all, let me give you a little background on Peggy Guggenheim. She was born in 1898 in New York City. And she went to Europe when she came into her fortune after her father had died tragically on the Titanic in 1912. In Europe, and specifically in Paris, she re-encountered her first husband, Lawrence Vail, who was a writer and artist whom she'd first encountered in New York City in a bookshop. She was completely overwhelmed by Lawrence Vail, who was a bohemian-like, good-looking, and he introduced her to the bohemian world of Paris in the 1920s. And it was thanks to him that she really encountered the avant-garde world in Paris. After several years of marriage and 2 children, Peggy decided that she had to do something different with her life. And in 1938, she decided to open a gallery in London. This was a successful affair, even though commercially not terribly successful, but she gave exhibitions to Wassily Kandinsky, his first solo exhibition in London, to the French surrealist Yves Tanguy, an exhibition of contemporary sculpture, which caused quite a scandal in London at the time. After about a year and a half of putting on exhibitions in London, but not making much money at all, Peggy resolved to close the gallery, but with always the intention of forming a collection of modern art. And she enlisted Herbert Reed, the English historian and art critic, whose dream it was to found a museum of modern contemporary art in London. With the onset of the war, Peggy then went to Paris, and she began her so-called picture-a-day shopping spree. This is when she collected the bulk of her collection of works of art, including paintings by Miro, sculptures by Brancusi, as well as works by Delaunay, Van Tongerloo, and many others. Peggy had to leave Paris and settled briefly in Marseille for a while. By this time, she had connected with the surrealist artist Max Ernst, who would eventually become her second husband. Finally, in the summer of 1941, Peggy and Max Ernst, as well as her ex-husband Lawrence Vail, their children, left France via Portugal on a Pan Am clipper and reached the shores of the United States in New York City in the summer of 1941. The collection that Peggy had assembled so far miraculously arrived a little while later, completely intact, a rather remarkable feat during this terrible, tragic time in world history. Peggy and Max Ernst settled in New York City, and in October 1942, with the help of the architect and designer Frederick Kiesler, Peggy opened her museum gallery, Art of This Century, on West 57th Street. This was an extraordinary gallery, unlike any one in New York City, and it quickly became the platform for young American abstract expressionists such as Jackson Pollock, whom Peggy would come to support for the next few years. At first, Peggy showed European art and the art of a European surrealist artist in exile, but then she quickly understood that it was her duty to support the art of her time, as her friend Samuel Beckett had always encouraged her to do. Peggy ran Art of This Century until 1947, giving exhibitions and first solo exhibitions to artists again like Jackson Pollock, Motherwell, Baziotis, Rothko, and many more. She also organized group exhibitions devoted solely to women and supported women artists like Irene Rice Pereira. After several years of running Art of This Century, Peggy wanted to return to Europe quite desperately. In 1947, she closes her gallery and decides to come back to Europe, where she'd wanted to establish her home and her final home. She's invited to show her collection at the 1948 Venice Biennale. The Biennale had been closed for several years due to the global conflict. But in 1948, when Peggy does show her collection in the Greek Pavilion, which was at Civil War, this is an amazing time for Peggy, an apotheosis of kinds. Finally, her collection is seen for the first time in its whole, with its European masters of early 20th century and also the young American artists, giving Italians and Europeans first-hand opportunity to see what was happening on the other side of the Atlantic. In 1949, Peggy finds Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, a mid-18th century palazzo, never finished, which looks surprisingly modern in this beautiful city. Peggy acquires it and in 1949 settles there with her collection and lives in Palazzo Venier until her death in December 1979. In 1951, Peggy starts to open her collection, her museum house, to the public several afternoons a week, showing great generosity in this regard, believing that art is for the benefit of everyone. Let's now go inside Palazzo Venier dei Leoni and look at some of the masterpieces that Peggy collected over her life. Here we are in the so-called Calder Hall, in the entrance of Palazzo Venier dei Leoni. The Calder Hall because here hangs great sculpture from 1941 by Alexander Calder, who was a pioneer of kinetic art. This is a wonderful exercise in equilibrium and balance of forms, reminiscent also of the work of his friends and colleagues Jean Arp and Juan Miró. On my left is a painting by the Italian painter Tancredi Parmigiani, who is an artist that Peggy supported, and she gave him a stipend and a studio in the basement of Palazzo Venier dei Leoni. Tancredi very much believed in the mark, in the strong mark and the colorful mark, which is very apparent in this canvas composition from 1957. He believed that the mark could give an idea of the illusion of space and also believed in the astronomical singularities of cosmos, which he could recreate on canvas. And on my right over here is a painting by the French artist Jean Hélion, who also on a flat two-dimensional surface also plays with this idea of balance and equilibrium of forms and colorful shapes. And here we are in the next gallery, a room which used to be Peggy's dining room, in fact, which you can see from the dining room table, which is still here, and its chairs, as well as various chests and other furniture, which Peggy was very fond of and collected over her lifetime. This room is historically the room dedicated mostly to Cubist works. And I would like to point out especially this masterpiece by Pablo Picasso, the poet, from 1911, when the Spanish artist was working very closely with his friend and colleague Georges Braque, whom you can see represented here to my left. Braque and Picasso were the inventors of the avant-garde movement, Cubism, whereby they broke down every element in the painting and really breaking away from centuries-long tradition of perspective in Western painting, and whereby you could see every single facet of a figure. I'd also like to point out this great canvas by Marcel Duchamp that he made in 1911-1912, Sad Young Man in a Train, which was one of the last such canvases that he made before turning to his famous ready-mades. Let's talk a little bit about the sculptures in this room, and particularly about the Romanian sculptor Constantin Brancusi. Here we have Maiastra, a type of bird, and birds were very important for Brancusi and extremely important within Romanian mythology. In his later Bird in Space, we really see the essence of the bird in flight, reaching out towards the sky, so to speak. I'd also like to point out this painting by the Italian artist Gino Severini, which he made after he'd spent some time on the coast south of Rome. Sea Dancer, a beautiful, vibrant painting. And you can notice how the artist has also painted on the frame, whereby the sea is really exploding outside the canvas. Now we find ourselves in the room which used to be the kitchen, but which now hosts paintings by mostly Russian artists. This early painting by Vasily Kandinsky, Russian-born artist, who decided to abandon his law studies and become a painter. And Peggy acquired several of his works, including this one where the artist is moving towards abstraction and where he makes use of splashes and dots and shapes of color in order to elicit some kind of emotion from the viewer. I'd also like to point out this work by the Italian artist Piero Dorazio, who follows in the tradition of European abstraction and who was very much influenced by the theories of light by his colleague Giacomo Balla. Let's now go over to what used to be Peggy's living room and library. In these rooms, we have works representing European abstraction, including Kandinsky, but also another great co-founder of abstraction, like the Dutch painter Piet Mondrian, that we see here in an earlier painting, and then here in the late 1930s. We continue with abstraction, European abstraction here, namely with this work of 1919 by the French artist Fernand Léger. Let's now look at this jewel-like painting by the American artist Irene Rice Pereira, who was an abstract artist working in New York City in the 1940s and 50s. And she was supported by Peggy Guggenheim, who gave her solo show in 1944. She sold several of her works, acquired this one for herself, and then eventually sold it. But many years later, the Guggenheim was fortunate enough to be able to receive it as a gift. So let's continue our tour through the galleries. To my right is a small portrait by Paul Klee. And to my left, I'm passing Joseph Cornell's magical boxes that he made in New York City. Let's go to the other side of the Palazzo now, where many of the surrealist works are on view, including works by Max Ernst, by René Magritte, the French artist Yves Tanguy. Here we come into one of the rooms which is dedicated to surrealism. Surrealism plays a vital part in the collection, thanks to Peggy Guggenheim's relationships with many of these surrealist artists. The Empire of Light, made in 1954, is a glorious painting by René Magritte, and which is one painting from his series Empire of Light. This beautiful painting is actually rather subversive, because while it is beautiful and glorious at the same time, it is day and night represented on the one and same canvas. Let's now turn to Max Ernst, the German artist who was also Peggy Guggenheim's second husband, albeit for a brief time. We have many works by Max Ernst in the collection, and the robing of a Bride is one of the emblematic paintings in the collection, in which Max Ernst considers ideas of magic and alchemy, themes that he was very, very interested in, that he pursued throughout his long career. I'd also like to point out paintings by Juan Miró, and also another highlight of the collection, which is this painting by Salvador Dalí, The Birth of Liquid Desires. Let's now go into what used to be Peggy Guggenheim's bedroom, which was once painted turquoise blue. And let's take a look at some of Peggy Guggenheim's earrings here in this box. At the top, we have a pair of small Alexander Calder brass mobile earrings, and at the bottom, tiny pair of miniature landscapes by the French surrealist Yves Tanguy. Peggy famously wore one of each when she opened her museum gallery, Art of this Century, in 1942, in order to show her impartiality between abstraction and surrealism. Peggy asked Alexander Calder to design a bedhead, and he made this beautiful, unique piece completely out of silver. And do take a look at these wonderful details, such as the dragonfly, the flower, the fish, and also take a look at these wonderful little rondelles, which are so typical of Alexander Calder's jewelry-like craftsmanship and artistry. I'd also like to take a look at this work by Juan Miró, We have 3 Miros in the collection, and this is Dutch interior number 2, inspired by 17th century Dutch painting that Miro had the opportunity of seeing when he visited Amsterdam in his youth. Let's continue into the gallery, which is dedicated to the American abstract expressionist artist whom Peggy Guggenheim supported so enthusiastically. Let's talk first about this great painting by artist Grace Hartigan, who belonged to the generation of American abstract expressionists and one of the few women who had quite a lot of success during her lifetime, especially during the 1950s. Peggy Guggenheim acquired this great painting by Grace Hartigan in 1959 from the artist studio in New York City when Peggy went to New York to attend the opening of her uncle Solomon Guggenheim's museum on Fifth Avenue. Hartigan was of Irish descent and painted a series of landscapes inspired by her Irish roots. Let's turn now our sights to this painting by Venetian painter Emilio Vedova, who was one of the very first artists that Peggy met when she came to Venice in 1947. Emilio Vedova was a very much politically involved artist and believed that he could use painting as a tool for social transformation. Let's now turn our attention to one of the great masterpieces of the collection, i.e. Jackson Pollock's Alchemy from 1947, one of his pioneering paintings where he uses drip, this new technique which revolutionizes 20th century American painting. Here Pollock has used as many as 17 kinds of paints, as well as materials such as sand and pebble, to create this extraordinary kind of bursting, explosive landscape. This painting was renovated and restored just a few years ago and is back to its original splendor. Peggy Guggenheim Collection is delighted to be able to boast 11 paintings by Pollock in the collection, and whereby we can also follow his trajectory from 1942, beginning as early as The Moon Woman, culminating in Alchemy and Enchanted Forest here on my right. Now, to conclude the tour, let's go outside onto the terrace on the Grand Canal. I'm standing in front of Marino Marini's sculpture, L'Angelo della Città, or the Angel of a City, an emblematic piece of a collection, and which Peggy Guggenheim had included in her first exhibition of contemporary sculpture here at Palazzo Venier dei Leoni in 1949. So here I am on the terrace of Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, where Peggy Guggenheim chose to spend the last 30 years of her life, and where she believed that her museum and collection that she created should remain forever. I was delighted to accompany you on this tour, and I do hope you enjoyed it.